Leviticus is a book that we typically shy away from because it seems to us to be nothing more than just a list of do's and don'ts. And we don't really like lists of do's and don'ts. We don't want to just tread through that material because it's just law after law after law, and that's just kind of difficult reading. And then there's concepts to us that are a bit foreign and hard to understand. What is it about this clean versus unclean animal business? What makes one animal clean and another animal unclean? Why is that the case? And all of this stuff. I think there's a lot of questions that we have when we go through books like Leviticus, but there's a lot of good stuff in books like Leviticus that I don't want us to miss. When you think about Leviticus, you probably think of it as a book that's way back in your mind. You don't give it a whole lot of thought. But it's my understanding that if you had grown up in a Jewish home and you were a young child raised in a Jewish family, the very first book of the Bible they would teach you about? Leviticus. Does that seem odd to you? Why would you teach your children Leviticus and its expectations before you taught them anything else? I'm not asking for you to give me an answer. It's just something I want you to think about. Okay? Whereas we kind of put it up on the shelf and say, yeah, we'll get to that later. The Jews said, no, this is the first book we need to study. And I think one of the reasons that that's the case is because Leviticus teaches us this key idea. Be holy, for I am holy. When you hear the word holiness, what do you think about? Yeah, you can tell me what's on the screen, it's fine. But what do you think about when you hear the word holiness? Okay, not everybody at once. I love hearing crickets chirping in the auditorium, right? Reverence. Okay, good. What else? Purity. What? Sanctifying. Set apart. Okay? Set apartedness, if I can say that. Something has been set aside for a distinctive purpose. God is the ultimate one who is separate. He's not like us. We are not Him. He is different. He is distinct. He is far beyond and far above. And He calls us, He calls His people to a great standard of holiness as well. The book of Leviticus is not just a book of rules. Yes, there are lots of rules, but look at this point. The law was not just rules to follow. It taught about God. You be holy because I am holy. And if you want to be holy, here's what that looks like. And so all of these laws about purity and holiness were designed to teach the Israelite people, this is who your God is. Now I want you to think about the Exodus story. At this point, chronologically, how long have the Israelite people been out of the land of Egypt? You remember? Yeah, it's been exactly a year. At the time Leviticus is written, it's been 1 year since the people have come out of the land of Egypt. When they were in the land of Egypt, what kinds of gods did they learn about? Egyptian gods. Many gods, little g, right? All the different idols and all the different worship practices of the Egyptians. Why does God, through Moses, give the people a book like Leviticus? So they'll know who the right God is. This is the true God. You need to learn who God is. And so Leviticus, as well as the other books, right? I mean, every book of the Bible teaches us about God in some way. But the Israelites didn't know the God of Abraham. And this is how God taught them, this is who I am. Okay? All right. There's a lot of chapters in Leviticus that speak about clean and unclean. And we need to understand what's behind this. So go with me to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11, and I want to look at verse 43 through 45. Leviticus 11:43. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourselves unclean with them, lest you be defiled by them. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate, make holy yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth, for I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. Now this is said in the context of the discussion of clean versus unclean animals. Which animals were approved for them to eat and which ones were not. But just look at that point in those verses. You be holy because I am holy. And if you follow these laws that I'm giving you, you will be holy as I am calling you to be. Look at chapter 15 and verse 31. Chapter 15, verse 31. This chapter has been talking about various ways that a person might become unclean. Thus, you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. How would they, in their uncleanness, why would they defile the tabernacle if they were unclean? What's going on there? Chirp, chirp. Okay, well, yes, but who is in the tabernacle? Yeah, that's where God is. That's where God's presence is. So if you're unclean, you don't come around there. You need to get yourself clean first before you come and defile the place where God's presence is. Sin, of course, is the greatest defilement that God's people might suffer. But so many of the things that are said in the book of Leviticus that make one unclean have nothing to do with sin or sinful behavior. Somebody would become unclean for something that was not sinful in its nature. So you see this a number of times in Leviticus. But if a person was unclean for any reason, then he was prevented, or she was prevented from doing certain things that they would otherwise be able to do, particularly things of worship, things of interaction and communion with God. So the issue is this matter of clean versus unclean. If a woman had a baby, she was considered unclean for a time. Not because there's anything sinful with having a baby. No. But God said that once you have a child, you're unclean for a time. If a man had leprosy or a skin disease, he was unclean. And there's different reasons that this might have been given or this might have been said. But is it sinful for somebody to have some skin disease like leprosy? No, it has nothing to do with sin. All right. Yes, Gina. No. No, but they could be in the courtyard area and bringing their sacrifices. So no, only the priests went inside the tabernacle. Only the high priest went into the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was. Okay? But you went into the tabernacle area, the courtyard area, when you brought your sacrifices to the altar of burnt offering, which was outside the tabernacle. Okay? Yeah, good question. All right. Okay, Randy and then Brad.
Just a footnote. She was unclean twice as long with a woman if she had a baby girl. 2 weeks instead of 1 week.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I was tracking with Gina. Not. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know.
Brad.
I don't know.
Just one step to get to that point. If they were left, they'd go outside the camp. God's growing
Right.
in the camp.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm not going to deal with this. So it wasn't, I think it kicks it up more than not just the tabernacle. I think it's the camp.
Yeah, that's right. So with the leprosy, which I think I have a slide on in a minute, the lepers had to go outside the entire camp. Not just they were prevented from coming into the tabernacle. And I understand that because leprosy was a contagious disease that could be passed from one to another. So there was a cleanliness from the standpoint that we usually think about it, like sanitation and hygiene purpose as well with that. All right, go over to Deuteronomy 23. Let's look at this passage. Verse 14, Deuteronomy 23, verse 14. Now this is talking about hygiene-related matters and how to deal with refuse inside the camp in verses 9 through 14. But verse 14, "For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may see no unclean thing among you and turn away from you." The Lord is among you in the camp. The tabernacle in which God dwells is in the center of the encampment. All the tents that are set up around the greatest tent, the tabernacle. God is among you. So clean up the place. Don't let refuse and disgusting water and waste be in the camp. God is among you. Get that out of there. It's unclean. I wonder if there were hand sanitizing stations all around the campground of Israel. Probably not. All right. If a person was unclean for any reason, male or female, if he was unclean, if she was unclean, she could not touch any holy things, could not be a part of public assemblies, could not partake of religious feasts. And so this highlights the importance of the need for cleansing. Again, we're not just talking about things involving sin. There were prescriptions that were given on how to deal with sin, right? You remember reading Leviticus 4 and the sin offering, Leviticus 5 and the trespass offering. That's how you deal with sin. But this is just uncleanness for some other reason that may have nothing to do with sin. Most of the time, someone was unclean only for the day. And they would have to take a bath, put on clean clothes, and then they could be clean again. In some cases, it was a week. Other cases, it was 2 weeks. If you were a leper, you were unclean perpetually until your leprosy went away. And there were some provisions made in the book for that. Laws of purity and cleanliness that God gave to the Israelites are contained in Leviticus 11 through 18. And we obviously can't say everything that we might like to say about that, but this is the outline of where these things are discussed. Now, I've tried to think about this question. Why is it that certain things made a person unclean? I mean, what makes it unclean if a woman has a baby? There's nothing sinful about that, as we've said, so why is she unclean? What makes it unclean if somebody fits into one of these chapters, right, where somebody has a skin disease? What is it that makes him unclean? Well, the simple answer to that is because God declared it that way. God said, this animal's unclean, this one's clean. Don't eat this one, it's okay to eat that one. That's the simple answer. God said it that way, and He has reasons that I may not understand. Okay, I can accept that. But is there something else? Is there something more? There might be. I think there could be a few different things that are the reasons why certain things were clean versus unclean. I'm going to put something out there for you to think about. I don't know that this is what it is, but as I was reading through these chapters in recent days, I realized something. And I'm just going to put this out there for you to think about. Leviticus 12, 1 through 8 talks about a woman's uncleanness after childbirth. Do you remember one of the consequences of the fall in Genesis 3? What did God say to Eve relating to childbirth? In pain, you will bring forth children. So presumably, before sin, had she given birth to a child, it would have been much easier. But now after sin, in pain, you will bring forth children. Think about someone with leprosy or a skin disease in Leviticus 13 and 14. Disease generally is a consequence of what? The fall, same thing, right? Genesis 3. When God created everything, behold, the Lord God looked upon all that he had made, and he saw that it was very good. Genesis 1:31. But then sin comes in the world on page 3, and everything starts to fall apart. What about a dead body? Numbers 19, if you come in contact with a dead body. Now, this could happen potentially a lot. There's a large group of people, 1 million plus people, maybe upwards of 2 million Israelites that are out in the wilderness together. I'm sure there were people dying on a regular basis. Well, we're not just going to leave their bodies lying on the ground. We've got to bury them. We've got to take care and dispose of the body. Somebody has to do that. And when you touch that when you touch that dead body, you become unclean. It's not a sinful thing, but what happened to Adam and Eve when they ate the fruit that they were not supposed to eat? In the day you eat it, you will surely. Death was a consequence of sin. You see, a lot of these things that are discussed in Leviticus, clean and unclean, a lot of the things that make a person unclean can somehow be connected to the fall in Genesis 3. So I wonder if that doesn't have something to do with it. Jeff, and then Joe.
Carry on that same thought. These laws that we had here remind you constantly, just going about your life, you're going to be that's where you are now. That's kind of what you're saying. You're going to come in.
It's going to happen, yeah.
Not obviously clean, discharge or whatever. You're going to do it, and what you need to do is spend your life trying to get clean.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that's where it goes.
Good. Good. Joe?
Yes, so my question is, were they told how to treat people who were unclean?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so there were different prescriptions depending on the nature of the uncleanness. Yeah.
And they would just turn it off after that time period was over? Like you said,
What do you mean, turn it off?
Well, the treatment as far as like...
Yeah, once they followed
different, I guess.
Once they followed the prescription to become clean, then they were clean and they could resume their normal activities. Yes. Yeah. But the prescriptions were different. Like you read about the cleansing of the leper's house in Leviticus 14. Like that's kind of a fascinating chapter to read. Like you don't think about a house, we don't think about a house being unclean in a sense. I mean, we talk about, this house is really, the house is dilapidated, it's falling apart, it's disgusting, it needs a good cleaning, but we don't, like that's not the same kind of thing that's happening here, right? But all of those things, if they went through the proper procedure to become clean, they were considered clean. Yes, good. All right, Jake.
So God has obviously a funny way of teaching people new things. This is, you look at these rules and these laws without digging in, like, man, not head scratching. There are a lot of weird things you have to do. There are a lot of weird things that you can do to get clean, and you have to go. Sometimes it takes days to become clean, right? And this would stop your life as you know it until you became clean. And it shows that I think he's trying to impress on people, this is perfect, this is hard.
good. Yeah, that's an excellent comment. That's really good. Okay, Matt, give us the last thought on this, and then we'll move on.
I like the idea of that God always wants what's best for his people.
Yes.
And there are a lot of practicalities that come along with all of these things, too. If you're starting a society, essentially, and laying the foundation of rules for a society of 2 million people that know nothing about these things, whether it's governance or social kind of structure or medicine and staying away from dead things that you don't know why they died. Well, that's a really good thing, regardless of sin. It also is really good practice that we all kind of do even now. There are a lot of things we don't know. They certainly knew none of these things about why God might have done this. But we can look back and see so many of the practical things that God has done for them that if you're going to start something from scratch with ignorant people, how do you go about explaining to them what you need to do? And all of them are good for them in one way or another.
Yeah. Okay, good. Really good. All right. Okay. It's all right, Dad, and then Marcus.
One principle we all do is God does not want the unclean to touch the clean, because it becomes unclean. And only he can declare it clean.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Because he made a law that you made a weak, or because he justifies us. You're not clean until he declares you clean.
Yeah, that's a good principle too. Marcus? Okay, good. Yeah, Marcus's comment was that this is foreshadowing what's going to happen in the temple in Israelite history, but even beyond that, the greater temple of Christ, that Christ's people are cleansed from defilements of the world and such. Really good. All right, let's talk about feast days and public worship days and some of the special things that were done at these times. There were a number of festival holidays, holy days that were given to the people, and these were given as usually as reminders of things that God had done for the people to bless them. And we can read about these in Leviticus chapter 23. Let's turn there together and just look at a couple of verses. Leviticus 23 talks about all of the different feasts that are given. But look at what is said in the first 2 verses when Moses introduces this. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, are these." Boom. And then he starts right into talking about all the different festival days. These are the feasts of the Lord. They are His. They are for Him. They honor Him, they worship Him, but they are also for the people, very much so. So these things are described in Leviticus chapter 23 and other places. I want you to look at this slide and you'll see the number of animals that are offered. Now these are different kinds. Sometimes it was lambs, sometimes it was a bull, okay? Just the number of animal sacrifices that were given to God on each of the days, all right? So, every single day there were 2 lambs, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. 365 days in a year times 2 is 730 animals. That's how we do the math on the side. That's what that number underlined means, okay? Now, Sabbath day. How many Sabbaths are there in a year? All right? 104, okay? New moon's first of the month. 11 additional animal, 11 times 12 is 132. Okay, don't you love math? All right, so here's how all of this worked. Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 7 days that followed Passover. 18 animals on each day for 8 days, 144. Feast of Weeks, 11. Feast of Trumpets, 10. Day of Atonement, 10. We're going to keep on adding up all these different days in the Feast of Ingathering to a total of... Whew! That's a lot of animals. Every year. And that's why... Oh, and by the way, this doesn't even include like individual. These are just the national offerings. This doesn't include Ben's individual sin offerings because he sinned against someone and had to make it right. It doesn't even count that. This is just on a national scale. This is how many animals were offered annually. You read in the book of Hebrews, and it talks about priests under the old law. And it says, every priest stands daily, offering sacrifices day after day. Yeah, they did. Tons of them. Garrett?
I was looking at Leviticus, and this part right here alone kind of, it's a big smack in the face, because when you start understanding how much work it goes into sacrificing and butchering an animal, like, it would be...
Even before that, I mean, some of you are farmers, or you grew up on farms and you had animals, and you know what it is to, you've got a cow that has a calf, and you see that little baby calf, and you help nurse that calf when needed, and you raise it, and you bind up its broken legs when that happens, and you help the calf all along, and you when it gets wounded, you take care of it, you nurse it back to health, and then you got to go offer it as a sin offering. Then it's going to be used on the Day of Atonement. Like, there's a lot that goes into raising animals on a farm. This is a huge thing. All of the sacrifices that were done. This is really a lot of work. Wayne?
Just a comment, there's no way to know this, but if there were, you said 1 million to maybe 2 million people.
Yeah, at least one, upwards of two.
If you go back to, I'm going to say the days when everybody was a farmer and they had animals and they grew crops and so on and so forth, I would guess that probably most families might have had 10 animals or 12 or something like that. Then you take that 12 and multiply it, figure out how many total animals there were.
Right.
There were more than 2
Yeah.
million animals.
Oh, my word. I can't imagine. Yeah, I can't imagine what this would have looked like. Absolutely.
And if you kill one without being a sacrifice or eat it, you're going to be held accountable for blood guilt.
Yeah.
So you just couldn't go out and just kill an animal. I mean, that's in Leviticus. So God took care of them because he set those aside for
Yeah.
this purpose.
This is good. This is good. All right. Specific festival days and worship days and days of observance. We're all very familiar with the Sabbath day. That was a weekly special time, special day. The new moon was another one, the first day of each new month. And so this came with great regularity as well. I'm going to fly through these because you understand I have to do that. I can't explore everything about this. And that's really not the purpose of this class. We're not trying to, we're trying to see the forest, not the trees, okay? There were 3 primary feasts. I do want us to look at this one. You can go to Exodus 23. We can read these verses about these primary feasts. Exodus 23, verse 14. You can also turn to Deuteronomy 16 and see the same thing said there. Exodus 23, verse 14. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. Verse 16, and the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you've sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you've gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. 3 times in the year. Connect this, verse 17, back to verse 14. Verse 14 says, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. But there were more than just 3 feasts. So were they not supposed to keep the other ones? No, yes, they were. But here's what verse 14 means. Verse 17, 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. On these days, the men of Israel had to travel to the place that God would set his name, which eventually will be Jerusalem. Males had to travel to Jerusalem in observance of these 3 feasts. The other feast days, they didn't have to make that pilgrimage, okay? But these, they did. So the yearly feasts that were given, feasts like the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was just mentioned in Exodus 23, one of the feasts requiring the trip for the males. And usually it wasn't just the males. It was the whole family, right? Think about Jesus in Luke 2 when his family went to Jerusalem for Passover, right? So Jesus and his whole family were there, not just Joseph. We've talked about the Passover, so I'm going to move on from that one. The Feast of Weeks. This is also what you know better as Pentecost. You're more familiar with that term as it's used in Acts chapter 2. Pentecost was 7 weeks after Passover. It was 7 Sabbaths, so that's 7 weeks, plus a day. So 50 days past Passover was Pentecost. In the 7th month every year, there were special times of worship and observance. On the first day of the 7th month was the Feast of Trumpets. On the 10th day of the 7th month was the Day of Atonement. And the Feast of Tabernacles was on the 15th day of the 7th month. So the 7th month was a really busy month for the Israelite people. I'm going to have to fly through some things here. I'm running out of time. Let's go to Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of the Ingathering. This was the 3rd festival that the men were required to make that trip to Jerusalem. This was celebrated at the end of the harvest time, the end of the growing season, leading into harvest time, I should say. This was a 7-day feast discussed in Leviticus 23, 33 to 44, beginning on the 15th day of the 7th month. This was a time, a feast of celebration and thanksgiving to God for the harvest that He has made possible. And this was also to serve as a reminder of how God cared for them in the years that they spent in the wilderness. How God took care of them and He provided for them. He gave them food as they were traveling towards the promised land. In this time, the people were to live in tents or in small tabernacles. These were simple booths or shelters that were oftentimes made out of natural materials, branches of trees and things, that they could make these temporary shelters. Now, why did they do that? Well, why did they have to live in those kinds of shelters? Well, again, it was a reminder of when God brought them out of Egypt and they were living temporarily as they were traveling towards the promised land. Remember the type of care that God gave to you. Remember how He provided for you as you were making your journey from bondage to the promised land. Wow, man, if that's not just dripping with New Testament ideas, right? So many things in the Jewish calendar and Jewish history are really looking forward to things that exist in the time of Christ. In the 7th year, it was a Sabbath year. The Israelites were supposed to let the land rest. They were not supposed to plant anything in the 7th year. God told them, in the 6th year, I will give you a bumper crop, and I will give you plenty of food. Let the land rest. But the people didn't do that. In the 7th year, slaves were to be released. There was a release of debts. The law was to be read in the 7th year as a reminder of God's word to the people. All right, I'm going to fly ahead to the last thing here. All right. Leviticus 18. Let's go there together. Leviticus 18. We're going to close with this. I know you're probably thinking, Ben, I had a question about such and such and you skipped over it. Well, I knew you had a question and that's why I skipped over it. No. Obviously, I'm kidding. Leviticus chapter 18. This is, hey parents, when you get to this chapter with your kids, tone it down a little bit. Might want to scale this one back a little, okay? This chapter is all about sexual immorality and different laws that are given about that. This is a pretty candid chapter. But the Lord says to Moses in verse 1 or verse 2, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, you shall not do. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you, you shall not do. You shall not walk in their ordinances. You shall observe my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord." Now, beginning in verse 6, he goes on to talk about all kinds of sexual sin that is forbidden. But I want you to understand why these things are forbidden. God, of course, said that they are forbidden, but he says, "I am the Lord your God, and these are my laws." This is what I think about human sexuality. There are a number of perverse things that you are not to do. Things that you saw done in the land of Egypt. You don't do that. Things that you will see when you get into the land of Canaan. You don't do that. You follow my teachings on these things. Okay? Once again, it points out the idea of God's holiness, his set-apartedness, and the holiness that is expected of his people. Go back to chapter 17. I'm going to close with this. This is not on the slide. But there's all this discussion in Leviticus about animal sacrifices and blood offerings and so forth. I want you to see the logic of that. Leviticus chapter 17. Look at verse 11. "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it," blood, "to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul." And some translations add, "by reason of the life." If an animal's blood is poured out, what happens to the animal? It dies. His life is in his blood. We talk about that language, the life blood, right? When you release the blood, it loses its life. That's the logic behind sacrifice. And I don't have time to explore it all the way. But when Jesus poured out his blood, he lost his life. But that same blood gives life to those who are his followers. Okay, thank you. I know that was like drinking from a hydrant. Hope you